Excellenz.
Excellency, Honorable Prime Minister, Mr. Ardern, we would like to welcome you and your delegation most cordially. We are grateful to have you here all the way from New Zealand. Welcome once again in this big conference hall. And thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. We're happy to have you. I would like to welcome the Excellency of New Zealand to Germany and many other excellencies from many other countries. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very delighted to have you here. Thank you for being our guests at the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. It is a great honor to us to welcome so many guests this afternoon. We have the General Secretary of the Social Democratic Party of Germany here with us, who is also a member of Parliament, Lars Klingbeil, who's a person that will enter into a discussion with the Honourable Prime Minister of New Zealand. Lars, thank you for being here today. Ladies and gentlemen, Madam Prime Minister is here on an official visit. She's not only to visit Germany, but also a host of many other countries of Europe. The fact that on the occasion of her official state visit, she is also here with us at the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, is going to deliver a presentation and enter into a discussion is a particular honor to us. For many years, the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation has had a whole sequence of eminent lectures, on the occasion of which renowned personalities from home and abroad have engaged actively in lively discussions and engaged in an exchange of ideas. We do believe that meetings of this particular fashion are of utmost significance because they help us learn from each other. And we need to learn from each other in order to be able to evaluate what the current position is like in other parts of the world. Learning from each other, knowing about each other, being interested in one another, talking to each other, are decisive factors that lay the foundation for a reasonable political interaction with one another. At this day and age, you might have gained the impression that it is particularly important that despite some harsh decisions and some very difficult announcements of very important decisions via Twitter or other social media, it is even more important to talk openly and candidly with each other in a culture of a mutual exchange of experiences with mutual respect, paying consideration to diverging interests, but respecting and acknowledging our respect for peace and freedom and open-mindedness in which we want to live with each other. This is a culture that we need to raise awareness about across all national borders. Today, the Prime Minister of New Zealand is with us. And to us, as an organization which is devoted to social democracy in the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, this is of utmost significance and of an outstanding importance. I told the Prime Minister in the run-up to the discussion, I said that very few guests that we were able to welcome at the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation were that interested and had such a positive reporting in the press even prior to her arrival, as was the case with you, Jacinda. And there is a very good reason for that. You got a very good feedback in the press, you as a person and also within your particular position. And with your country, you raise a lot of hopes. We do hope that apart from all the very important economic matters, new inspiration will be provided to us for domestic developments of the respective countries. Economic success is just one thing, but it needs to be combined with social justice, economic success, and ecological responsibility. This is something that we were informed about concerning your government program, and it's been far beyond the borders of New Zealand and inspired us significantly. And this is why we're really looking forward to your presentation. It is really remarkable, and this is what we found out in the talks prior to this meeting. It is remarkable how similar challenges have become in different parts of the globe. We are living in totally different parts of this planet, but nevertheless, the changes we are facing are rather similar. And I think this is why we have to learn a lesson. We have to learn from each other. It is always very decisive to act in the interest of the general public. You need to pursue policy strategies in the interest of the common good. We try to do everything possible and leave no stone unturned in order to support families, and especially children, in rich societies. It cannot be accepted at all, and this also holds true for Germany in particular, that housing become a scarce commodity. It has become a luxury because housing is hardly any longer affordable in Germany, and this is not at all acceptable. At this day and age, it is still unacceptable that there is still a great deal of inequality between men and women to the detriment of women. And you, Honourable Prime Minister, have made a lot of intriguing statements on all these different topics. And this really strengthens us in our aspiration in order to contribute to the developments in these policy areas. You have given a priority to climate change in your country, and that to us is very well understandable, but you also set a moral model for the policy realms in other parts of the world, especially and in particular for an industrialized nation such as the Federal Republic of Germany. You very explicitly made this point in all the publications that I mentioned before, including the press. You also fight for a fair and just exchange of goods between different nations, and this really is inspiring to us because we want to join forces in order to fight against protectionism and isolation. But we want to engage in fair competition and fair trade, respecting and considering each other's interests, but also respecting and considering the interests of those countries that require our utmost solidarity, because they have a lot of catching up to do. And because if we want to act in solidarity and based on the principle of equality across the continents, we need to take on responsibility for all these developments, be it in Asia, in South America, or be it in Africa. All the people of the world need to be supported because we also have to take care of them. You have embarked on a very particular approach with regards to these matters, and this is why I'm really looking forward to your presentation. You, Honourable Prime Minister, combine this with a very impressive and nice way of presenting yourself. You're very kind, and this is why I think your political strategies will be particularly successful, and this is why you also play a role model for us. We are very happy and we feel very honored to have you here. Let me welcome you once again most cordially. And now we are looking forward to your presentation. And then afterwards, you will have a discussion with Lars Klingbeil and Yasmin Mahimi. His predecessor is here with us as well. I would like to welcome her most cordially as well. We will then have a lively discussion, which will be streamed via the internet in order to reach out to all those who are not here in this conference hall today, but who would like to follow the discussion. And the people outside will be given the opportunity to ask questions via mail, and we will ask you to answer them as far as possible. Once again, we welcome you most cordially, and the floor is yours.
Guten Tag, and can I say kia ora koutou katoa, as I would greet you in New Zealand. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm especially grateful to be hosted by FES. Can I acknowledge the Deputy Secretary of the SPD and others here, some in the room who I recognise. Hello, my old friend Franz. It's wonderful, a really wonderful opportunity to be here. Some of you may well know that some years ago I was the president of the International Union of Socialist Youth. It was a role that gave me an insight into many, many things. My poor command of other languages was one. In fact, if you asked any of my multilingual board members at the time, they would have told you that based on my accent, they weren't entirely convinced I even spoke English. But I also developed a huge appreciation for the many globally focused think tanks within Europe. And I acknowledge the very special role that FES has played for a number of years. And we are very envious of that. I also do want to acknowledge your Chancellor. In a changing international environment, it is imperative that we strengthen ties and relationships with countries who share similar values. I know I am one of many who is grateful for your nation's much-needed leadership at a time when international systems have come under significant strain. As countries, not only do we share values, we share similarities in our political system. Our election was held in September last year, and in the aftermath, we faced considerable pressure to speed up our coalition negotiations. In fact, there was a reasonable amount of frustration over the time it took for us to conclude our negotiation, produce and sign our coalition and our confidence and supply agreements. It took a grand total of 15 days. Even if our talks were comparatively short, I have an appreciation for the complexity of such negotiations, whether in your country or mine, not just because of the public pressure that surrounds them, but for the internal party political matters that must be factored in too. It's not easy because compromise is not easy, nor is maintaining distinct party identities while also building consensus on issues as a government. Now, I am in no position to share any particular insights, especially in a country that has operated under this system of governance for longer than ours. But I can at least say that in New Zealand, I am focused on demonstrating that coalition governments can champion both consensus and diverse views for the national good. Wish me luck. But for today, my mind is focused squarely on issues that are dominating the international agenda and have done so for some time. Whatever the news headline, the underlying theme in global politics seems to be the same, that the rules have changed, economically and politically. For those of us who identify ourselves as being part of the progressive movement, there is no question that this unsettled environment has led to challenging questions from the public and voters, and challenging political outcomes in debates, elections, and referenda. This is not new. A decade ago, as the president of the International Union of Socialist Youth, I visited the United Nations in New York for a gathering of the Socialist International. Present were leaders like Georgios Papandreou, who at the time was leader of the opposition, and Joseph Stiglitz. We were there to discuss the emerging financial crisis. At the time, we were staring down the barrel of a hugely unsettled period for countries and their citizens, and there was a rallying cry for progressive nations and their governments to respond. Some would argue that that response never came. More than a decade later, we continue to face the challenges of what I would characterize as a sense of global uncertainty. Globalization, of course, isn't new. In New Zealand, we have grappled with this issue and its impact for decades. But the sense of insecurity seems to have only strengthened over the years. The benefits from globalisation have been distributed disproportionately to the few. There is a growing sense that ordinary people are working harder just to stay in exactly the same place. Add to that rapid technological change, where even in a country as small as New Zealand, the workforce faces the prospect that more than 45% of jobs will no longer exist or will be completely replaced in just 2 decades, and it is little wonder that that sense of insecurity has grown. Now, as politicians, we have choices. Choices in how we respond to this growing but justifiable dissatisfaction. We can offer a message of hope, or we can offer a message of fear. People need security. They need to hear from their political leaders that we anticipate that change, that we have a plan, that we understand their need for job security, that we understand their need for housing security, and that we understand the need for hope for the next generation so that they too can have the future that their parents had, if not a better one. And if we do none of these things, we leave a vacuum for fear and for populism. Now, the challenge for progressive and inclusive movements, from my perspective, lies in delivering that sense of security whilst also staying true to the notion of open borders, fair trade, international responsibility, and other principles that have guided a country like New Zealand for a number of years. In New Zealand, I believe we are starting to meet that challenge. The government I lead is determined to demonstrate that you can be an outward-looking trading nation that also supports and delivers on the basic needs and necessities, including of security, for the place who call New Zealand home. We want to prove that it's possible for a progressive and inclusive trade agenda. In this, I know that we are not alone. Today, I want to share how New Zealand is trying to meet this challenge and highlight ways in which New Zealand and Germany can work together in taking this vision forward. As a small island nation, you could say that New Zealanders don't just believe in an open, fair, rules-based international trading system. We are, in fact, entirely reliant on it. Without clear, fair, and enforceable rules to trade under, small countries like ours are thrust to the margins as the large and powerful leverage ever greater privileges for themselves. New Zealand knows what it means to be exposed to the vagaries of the world marketplace. Our key goods exports are agricultural products, which remain the most heavily protected from international competition of all economic sectors in all our key markets. Unsurprisingly, we've spent the last 70 years investing in the rules now established in the WTO system. Over the past 30 years, we have sought to build on that framework through the negotiation of a network of bilateral and regional free trade agreements. This has enabled us to reduce barriers in our key markets and give our exporters the legal certainty they need to grow their exports and our national prosperity. Our FTA footprint, now covering markets that account for more than half our trade, has given our exporters more choice and flexibility, which in turn has increased the resilience in our economy. So it is deeply concerning to New Zealand to see the rules-based global trading system under strain. There are no winners in trade wars, only different degrees of losing, with the small and vulnerable inevitably losing the most. That is why we are committed to working with others like Germany who share our commitment to the rules-based trading system to ensure the gains of the last few decades are not lost. But we don't want to just maintain the status quo. We want to work to make the rules-based trading system fairer and more responsive to the needs and expectations of our citizens. Ensuring that this happens will be vital for rebuilding the fragile public consensus around trade. Now, our starting point has been to design our trade policy to address public concerns about the current global economic system. But it also means applying a progressive and inclusive lens to trade policy objectives in general, and trade negotiating mandates in particular. It is for these reasons that just last week, we set out New Zealand's vision for a new, progressive and inclusive trade agenda. One focused, as the EU has done, on trade for all. As a government, we've already set some of our key expectations for this agenda, including our opposition to investor-state dispute settlement clauses. But now we are in the process of openly seeking the public's view on how trade can contribute to our policy objectives, like combating climate change, upholding labour rights, protecting scarce natural resources, and implementing our sustainable development goals. Now, some would argue that trade is not the place to attempt to advance social and economic goals, but I do not accept that. To give just one example, agreeing effective trade disciplines on current subsidies to fossil fuel and to the overexploitation of fisheries could make a major contribution towards addressing two of the most urgent environmental priorities of our time, climate change and a decline in fish stocks. Progressive and inclusive growth also means ensuring that our trade and economic settings help us meet the greatest challenge faced by our next generation, and that is climate change. Now, in New Zealand, we have committed to the goal of a net zero carbon economy by 2050. This is an ambitious target, and one that will require fundamental changes to the New Zealand economy. But this transformation will also throw up new opportunities, especially for those businesses and nations who choose to take the lead. And it's our view that we can create an ecosystem that encourages that leadership. As part of the coalition government's agreement with our support parties, the Green Party, we will establish a green investment fund to stimulate new investment in low-carbon industries and help businesses seize these opportunities. But equally, there is a lot New Zealand can learn from Germany about how to help businesses adjust and to realise the full benefits, not just from the transition for our environment, but also as we face the challenges of technological change. I'm particularly impressed by the framework your Platform Industry 4.0 initiative has provided for driving the development of an advanced, digitally connected economy, bringing together government, business, academia and trade union stakeholders as well. Now, in the same way, we recognise that research and innovation have a central role to play too. We've committed to trying to significantly lift the spending on research and development to a level of 2% of GDP over the next 10 years. But none of this agenda, be it R&D investment or trade reform, is a means to an end. None of it actually tells us much about our real and genuine success. When our government was formed 5 months ago, it was through a consensus that all of our pursuits should be driven by an agenda for a better life for all our people, particularly the most vulnerable, growing an inclusive economy, and the protection of the environment. Achieving that means officially redefining our measures of success. Next year, we will be the first nation in the world to report our annual progress against a range of measures in a living standards framework which tracks the well-being of our people and our environment alongside the traditional measures of economic growth. A broadened definition of progress has been called for by the IMF and the OECD in response to growing inequality in developed nations, which is not only eroding the social fabric of those countries, but is slowing their economic growth. For me, it's much more simple. If economic growth is not reflected in the well-being of your people, then we are asking the wrong questions. As Prime Minister, I would find it impossible to tell a child living in a cold, damp home this winter, or worse still, a car, that New Zealand's economy is going well if her parents have just lost their jobs and they can't afford a roof over their head or to turn the heating on. Our new wellbeing measures will be the reality check to help ensure that when we are designing our trade, our social, and our economic policy, we're designing it to benefit the many, including the girl in a cold, damp home, not just the few. And we've already started that policy redesign. Since the formation of our coalition government in November last year, we've said we want to see a genuine transformation in the way we create and share New Zealand's prosperity. We're already investing in our regions through a $1 billion annual fund. We're responding responsibly to the global challenge of climate change. And we're lifting family incomes through a significant increase to the minimum wage and a package of credits which will lift low and middle income family incomes by an average of 75 New Zealand dollars a week. We've put child wellbeing at the heart of what we do. I myself hold the child poverty reduction portfolio. In fact, we created the child poverty reduction portfolio. And we will be requiring by law the setting of bold targets to reduce the proportion of children living in poverty and hardship. These, if met, would take child poverty and deprivation rates among our children in New Zealand from some of the highest in the OECD down to some of the lowest within 10 years. We also want to build the child poverty enthusiast in the crowd, just like warms my heart. We also want to build the capability and capacity of our people by rebuilding our core public services like health and education, the foundation for any strong society. Education is particularly key for us. Within the next 10 years, as I've said, nearly half of all our jobs in New Zealand could be dramatically different or gone, and we cannot allow our citizens to simply sit there without a plan for the future. They need us to prepare for the unknown. They're relying on us to create a just transition away from the 20th century industries to modern clean ones. Now, without such a plan, towns and communities will wane along with those sunset industries. Education is crucial to preparing democracies like ours for the technological challenges that we face. That is why one of the first changes my government made within the first 100 days of taking office was to make the first year of post-secondary education free. Most people who are eligible, education enthusiast in that corner, most people who are eligible for what we call fees free are in fact first-time adult learners who are retraining or upskilling. Well, research tells us that those who are educated lead happier and more fulfilled lives. It's also true in a small nation like New Zealand that we simply cannot compete on the world stage if our people do not have the skills they need. Our eventual goal is for everyone to be earning, learning, caring, or volunteering, so that everyone has an opportunity to contribute in some way, but also at the same time to reduce social isolation, which we see particularly prevalent in our older citizens. But what does all of this add up to? In essence, it's our own formula to meet the challenges that we face by unapologetically putting the well-being of people and the well-being of our environment at the centre of what we do. Connectedness, inclusion, and the principles of kindness in the way we govern is how we choose to meet the challenge of global uncertainty. And yes, I use the word kindness a lot in New Zealand. As I stated earlier, New Zealand has recently appreciated the global leadership that has been shown here in Germany in recent years. In these times of change and challenge, countries that share values and which are prepared to show responsible leadership must stand together. On that front, I thank you too for your support of New Zealand as we pursue an FTA within the EU. I look forward to the friendship and partnership which we have with Germany going closer still, as we each strive to meet the challenges we face as like-minded countries with a shared vision for a fair society and a stable rules-based world. Change is not only coming, change is already here, and I truly believe we can make it work for the good of all and face it with a sense of hope. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
So, Prime Minister, dear Jacinda, thanks a lot for the for the positive speech, for all your thoughts, and I'm very honored to be with you together here on the panel and have a discussion. So my time in UC ended 2 years before you came president. That's one of the moments I'm feeling like a very old man. So we have a short Q&A. We have some questions reach us by Twitter, by social networks, but first of all, I quickly want to comment on 2 points and want to give you on the first 2 questions. One of your...
It's your prerogative to do that.
Yes.
Yes.
One of your points was the point of digitalization. It's one of the topics I'm working on, and I think for us as progressive parties, it's one of the most important points. So people reading in newspapers every second, every third day that they will lose their jobs by digitalization. You mentioned the transformation we have in the job markets, and you mentioned also the point of education, of training, retraining, and I ask if there are other points we have to discuss as progressive parties, maybe the point of the welfare state, social state, what should happen, or the question of do we need taxes on robots, for example. There's a debate also in the progressive movement of if we have to change also on these points, and maybe you can give us some thoughts on that. But before that, I will mention the second point and give you a second question, and that is on climate change. I'm very thankful that you mentioned sustainable development, the question of new trade policy. And if I look to my party, Social Democratic Party, we see that there maybe is a conflict. We are a traditional party, we are always strong on industry policy. But now I see in the last years we have a young group, a lot of young people joining our party, and they have a strong focus on climate question. It's very important for them to talk about digitalization, talk about justice, but also talk about climate questions. And I ask myself, could we bring both together, industry policy and climate policy? Or maybe you can give us some impressions of the discussion in your party. Is there a conflict, or do you think we can balance both of these industry policy and climate policy and can bring this together? So these are my 2 questions, and then I have a lot of other questions from Twitter and Facebook, but...
I'll try and answer those 2 as quickly as I can, because they're excellent questions. Yes, I do think that there is some convergence around these issues, literally, but also just in principle. You know, the key for addressing both the technological advancements that we face and the impact that will have on our traditional workforces, and also the issue of climate change. For me, the principle we need to face both of those is with a plan. That we, at least in New Zealand, have experienced in the past the jarring effects of having to respond quickly to the economic realities that we're facing without having had a plan in place, because instead we've focused on short-term electoral cycles, and in New Zealand that means 3 years. So the focus for us has been on planning for the future. So when it comes to the future for our workforce, while we were in opposition, we undertook a piece of work called the Future of Work. We brought together business, employers, employees, to say what will the future workforce, where will the generation of jobs be coming from for New Zealand in the next 20, 30 years. What we discovered in undertaking that piece of work is actually we cannot predict, as we have actually tried to predict in the past. We went through this process a few decades ago and decided that biotechnology was the place to be. And I think probably our mistake was trying to predict that future. If you can't predict your future, you need to instead plan for your workforce to be agile, to be mobile. And that for us means investing in lifelong learning. And I don't need to tell Germany about that. But certainly for us, that's something that we haven't invested widely in before, and that's where we're putting our investment. At the same time, you're right, what about our welfare state? And we tried to start a debate around things like universal benefits. But that's something that was met with some rebellion amongst our domestic population, and so that's something that's been put on hold. But there is a certain inevitability to those conversations. We have we have a strong welfare state, but there is, I think, a discussion to be had about what that would look like in the future as people become more mobile in the workplace. On climate change and young people entering into politics because of it, again, where I see there being overlap, it's about having that plan. Last week in New Zealand, we announced that we will not be issuing any more offshore oil and gas exploration permits in New Zealand. Now, that was a significant move on our part, but it was an acknowledgement that if we don't make that decision today, I'll be postponing it for a leader who will be in place when I'm long gone in politics, having a lovely time somewhere in the Mediterranean. But who does that benefit and who does it harm? Well, it harms those industries and those regions, because it's regions in New Zealand are heavily reliant on those sources of income. By saying to them now, we're not going to undercut the permits that are out there already. There are over 50 in New Zealand. There will be drilling for oil and gas in our country for some time to come. But unless we draw a line in the sand, I would be leaving those regions high and dry in the future. And I wouldn't be sending a clear signal to the market that we have to start investing in alternatives to fossil fuels. So for me, the ultimate principle, we have to have a plan, and we have to demonstrate to the public we have a plan.
Thanks a lot. Then I have a question from Twitter. It's about trade policy. Trump said US could rejoin Trans-Pacific Trade TPP agreement if deal was improved. And the question is, how do you react to that?
So we've heard that a couple of times now. I don't think that will change the trajectory for the TPP, which is in the process of being ratified by the various signatories, and so that will continue. If the United States wanted to join, as a number of countries have indicated that they're interested in doing so, then they would need to be a part of a negotiation. There were over 20 provisions that were suspended after the departure of the United States, and so that would really trigger a fairly significant renegotiation. What it does say to me, though, is for all those countries who have said they're interested in CPTPP, that actually, in an environment where we're seeing tit-for-tat protectionist moves, that those multilateral arrangements are going to become even more important, particularly for nations that are reliant on trade like ours.
Next question could be from my Twitter channel, but it's not from me. Social democracy in Europe is currently experiencing a crisis. Which advice would you give social democratic parties to renew themselves?
I've been asked this a surprising number of times. Every country has its own unique set of domestic political circumstances, and so I always exercise caution in trying to draw too much from an individual country's experience, because New Zealand, we are unique. We're geographically isolated. We're a small population. We have a long history of that we are proud of. Things like 125 years ago, we granted women the right to vote. 125 years ago, we've been proudly nuclear free. We use our voice on issues of international importance, but at the same time, we are geographically isolated. Our borders are protected by great expanses of ocean. We don't have the same debates around migration that you have within the EU. We are different. I would not counsel any political party to change leaders 7 weeks before an election. In fact, I counselled my own leader not to change leaders 7 weeks before an election, and there is no doubt that changed the nature of our election. It meant there was a sudden break in the system, and everyone thought, well, this is suddenly quite dramatic. We'll pay some attention to what's going on. But we campaigned on issues that I'd say would not be too dissimilar to what you campaigned on here. That the system as it was not serving people. That there was underinvestment in health and education. And we have this political leader in New Zealand who said a number of years ago in the 70s that all anyone ever really needs is something to do, somewhere to live, someone to love, and something to hope for. We tried to get back to those basics. We made it about housing. We made it about jobs and job security. We made it about hope, you know, making sure that we actually didn't give up on this idea that life could be better for the next generation. And we made it about our environment. And I think by also being really positive, despite having been in opposition for 9 years, which inherently makes you quite negative, we were really positive about what was possible for the future and spoke about the plans we had and the security we wanted to give people in the future. And somehow that formula paid off.
Thanks. You mentioned housing. There's also a question on Twitter about rents and housing prices. They are skyrocketing not only in Berlin but also in New Zealand. How do you deal with the issue of affordable housing in New Zealand?
And these, as they would be in Berlin, I imagine these are complex issues for us. If there was only one thing that was contributing to the problem, it would have been solved a long time ago. We at least acknowledged that it had reached crisis point, and it has. In New Zealand, you'll pay on average New Zealand dollars over $1 million for a very standard house in Auckland. We have some of the lowest home ownership rates we've had in over 50 years. For Indigenous New Zealanders, home ownership sits at 29%. And those, for us, are staggering statistics that say we are losing that Kiwi dream that we have, that you can own your own home and you can secure your future. And the knock-on effect is, means that our universal pension regime is inadequate if you rent a home in your old age. So there's a number of reasons why socially this mattered to us, why it created fractured communities and why we wanted, and transient communities, because we don't have a culture of renting long-term in New Zealand. If you rent, on average, you're moving every year. That means you're changing your children's school every year. So it was a social issue for us. We said, if it's a crisis, if the market isn't responding, then the government will. And we committed to getting on and intervening in the market by building ourselves 100,000 homes over 10 years, with 50,000 of them in our biggest city. That was a very bold move. But our view was, we've done this before as a Labour government. When we first started building state housing, we would do it again. The difference was this time it would be for the market, so that first home buyers could purchase a home. We also had no rules that really regulated people offshore who had no interest in New Zealand, who were foreign speculators, from buying in the New Zealand market. That was a real bugbear for people. Look, if you migrate to New Zealand and you want to call it your long-term home, we should be defending your right and ability to buy. But if you have no interest in New Zealand, we decided to draw a line there, and that became something that was of real interest during the election as well. But it was about being ambitious, and it was about challenging the status quo and saying there'll be cases where the market isn't responding, and so we will instead.
Okay, 2 questions left. One is about diversity. So we have an ongoing debate in Social Democratic Party in Germany about diversity. We want to become more female, we want to become younger, people from different job backgrounds. And in our representation, we also have a big debate about people with migration background in responsibility in our party. What is your experience, and how can we make this work?
You know, this is one of the gifts I see of MMP, is that over time it has made New Zealand's parliament more representative, and it now reflects New Zealand. And if anything, I think that's what our ultimate goal should be. Parliament should look like the country that it serves. And that means being diverse. We finally started reaching double digits and getting the kind of representation for women, for instance, that we needed once MMP came in. But it was not enough. In particular, for a time in my party, you could see that women were being represented more and more by coming in on the list than necessarily in electorate seats. And so that was an indication to us that we needed to do a lot more work to support women to be selected at that local level. But in the end, what made the big difference? We said it's got to be 50%. And we put a requirement on ourselves. And whenever I get challenged by that and the assumption that somehow, you know, are we proving that we're no longer a meritocracy, you cannot tell me that there are not 60 women in New Zealand that deserve to be in Parliament. You cannot tell me that. 60. I'd like to think that, well, we now, as a party, fell just shy of 50% women in our caucus. And we, at the moment, the New Zealand Parliament has the highest number of women we've had, close to 40%. But that's not enough. It's not just about women, although that's obviously incredibly important to us. It's also about the diversity. It's also about making sure that there is representation of Indigenous New Zealanders. Now, we're unique in that we have a system that will by default mean that there are Māori seats, which means that we have 7 Māori MPs, which Labour currently holds every single one of those. It's something that we feel proud of as well. But it's equally, that's not sufficient either. But we at the moment have the highest number of Māori and Pacific Islanders in the New Zealand Parliament that we've ever had, and at the cabinet table. And so that level of representation we view with some pride, but also know that we cannot take those things for granted. And it's something that we have to constantly be vigilant about at a party level to make sure that we're nurturing and ensuring that at every level of the party we have that representation so that there is a path right through to the top. Our current Deputy Leader of the Labour Party is Kelvin Davis, an ex-principal of Māori descent from Northland in New Zealand, and it shouldn't have taken us that long to have a deputy who's Māori.
My party will...
Kurt supports diversity.
My party will become a female party leader on next Sunday.
How could it have taken you so long?
It's 155 years too late, but
yes,
it's happening.
I mean, I congratulate you.
It's happening now. So, and I don't know if I could say we are proud of this because it's so late, but it's a good sign that it will happen now. Last question.
Now you need to have 3 in a row.
First of all, we need one that stays a little bit longer, so and it's not so normal in the party in the moment. Last question. Last question, because I was told that we should close 5 minutes to 4. The last question is very simple. What could New Zealand learn from Germany, and what could Germany learn from New Zealand?
Hopefully I touched on that a little bit. I mean, some of the things that I think are common to us are the things that I really value, and in an international environment it is that sense of the importance of taking that independent position that's principled and based very much on the use of international institutions. That's something that we value hugely, particularly in the current international environment, and so that's something that I think probably we share. What can we learn from you? Well, anyone with a trade surplus, we look over at and look at what's going on. And the work that you're doing around taking a real tripartite approach to some of the challenges of digital transformation, that's something in Industry 4.0 we're really interested in. We also, you may not know, we also do quite a bit of work together in the science, research and development space. We have done for 40 years. And for us, we wouldn't mind taking that to the next level. And some work's already underway, this may surprise you, for her to do some work collectively on space and the research we can undertake, particularly as it relates to climate change, by working together in that area. So I guess the answer I'm giving you is that I think there's a huge amount of room for countries that share values, for countries that share ambition around well-being of our citizens, to work collaboratively. So we can work and learn from each other in that way, and I really favour that because each of us will have very different circumstances. So some of the lessons I could share with you around attracting German tourists probably aren't relevant to you, but for me it's about what we can achieve together.
Okay. Thanks a lot. At the end, because we're running out of time, I just want to mention, in these days we see how important the international debate is. We see how important it is to have talks over borders about values, about trade policy, about social democratic policy, about also progressive policy in trade and climate questions. And this is a very impressive speech you gave. There are some thoughts for our debate we have here in Germany, we're facing currently in Germany, and I think the aim must be to become stronger as progressive parties, as progressive forces, because we see there are other forces on the international level in the moment, and we don't want them to become stronger. Thanks a lot for coming here. Thanks a lot for the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation for having this debate here. All the best for you, and thanks that you came to Germany, and we're very happy to have you here and to have a dialogue together with you and your country. Thanks a lot.
Nur für unsere Gäste, Sie sind...
Just by way of information to our guests, you are most cordially invited to stay for a reception to your right and for me to my left.